Okay, this is the continuation of Unit 1. This is Unit 1, Part 2. So now I'm going to talk to you about homeostasis. What homeostasis is that it's a process that allows for a stable environment, an appropriately stable environment in a particular system. Let's say, for example, body temperature. Homeostatic mechanisms in your body try to maintain a balanced body temperature. If you get too hot, you start to sweat to try and cool off. If you get too cold, you'll start to shiver to try and warm up. So you have essentially, your surroundings may change, and therefore your body's response has to change in order to maintain that stable temperature. But the thing that's under homeostatic control may also change itself in its dynamic itself. Dynamic meaning it also may have to change. For example, your heart rate may change depending upon the demands of the body and the requirements for oxygen. So if you're running and your muscles need a lot of oxygen, then your heart has to pump faster and your heart rate will rise. So it's a control mechanism. Homeostatic control mechanisms are such that they maintain the appropriate level of a particular function of a particular system in response to what's happening around the person in the person's body or inside or outside of the body. And there are all kinds of factors that can interact to maintain that homeostatic level or state of homeostasis. So yes, it is trying to maintain a level, but it's trying to maintain an appropriate level, not a fixed level. So again, using the example of your heart rate, a normal resting heart rate is say about 72 plus or minus 10. But that doesn't mean that it is always at 72. If you're exercising, the heart rate will go up. If you stand up from a lying position, your heart rate will rise. If you lie down, your heart rate will slow down because it doesn't have to pump against gravity. It doesn't have to pump the blood up to your head when you're lying down, so your heart can slow down a little bit. So it's maintenance of an appropriate level through a lot of control mechanisms to maintain the level of activity that's appropriate for the conditions at that time. Okay. The control mechanisms have a particular kind of arrangement. You always have a receptor that's monitoring. You have sensory receptors that monitor your internal environment that can sense and respond to changes. You have a control center, which is typically your central nervous system, and then effector responses. The central nervous system control center sends out stimuli to responses to that are appropriate, so effector tissues act in the appropriate manner. You have certain parameters that are under homeostatic control. They include things like temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, pH, blood glucose. There are many things in the body, and they're under a very careful control, which is constantly getting which is constantly getting feedback information from sensory tissue that can sense the level of that parameter, feeding that back into the control center. So you have receptors, a control center, and effectors. So here is an example of that kind of homeostatic mechanism or control mechanisms. What you have here is some sort of stimulus that is producing a change in a variable, an important variable that has to be under homeostatic regulation, like say body temperature, glucose level, whatever. Okay, so you get a change in particular variable, and that gets detected by receptor, and receptors are nerve tissue typically. It's what you have are neuroreceptors. You have receptors for light, they're in your eye. You have receptors for pain in your skin, you have receptors, temperature receptors, you have sound receptors in your ears. It's all nervous tissue that's specialized to be able to detect a particular type of stimulation. Pain receptors, pressure receptors that monitor your blood pressure, all kinds of different receptors, constantly monitoring your environment. So you can get maybe a change in the activity that a receptor is sensing. And so the sensor is detects a change, and that information is sent into the control center, which is the central nervous system, either the spinal cord or the brain. Both form, the spinal cord and the brain together form the central nervous system. And then that sends out information to effector tissue if a response is required. So information gets sent out to effector tissue. And you get a response changing some sort of that is able to change that variable back to a controlled, balanced level, in a level that's appropriate for what is happening to the body at the time. Now there are a number of, these are feedback mechanisms, and there are two major important types of feedback mechanisms that are involved in homeostatic regulation to maintain an appropriate response level of activity of the system. One very common kind of feedback mechanism is called a negative feedback mechanism, where in which the output shuts off the original stimulus. So, for example, in the regulation of blood glucose levels, if the blood glucose level rises, then what you get is that's detected, and the response is the release of insulin from the pancreas. And what insulin does is that it allows cells to take up glucose from the blood. So the glucose level rises in the blood serum after a meal, in the plasma of the blood after a meal. It's detected, and the response, in this case, the response, it's not detected through, this is one example where it doesn't involve nerve tissue, but has a direct effect on the organ, the pancreas itself. So the pancreas responds by releasing insulin, and that goes into the blood plasma, and it allows cells throughout the body to take up glucose. So as the cells take up the glucose, the blood glucose level drops. And as the blood glucose level drops, insulin stops being released. So that's a negative feedback system. The output shuts down because the original stimulus is not there anymore. The glucose is being reduced. I don't know if this wording, output shuts off original stimulus, is the right necessarily way to express it. But it is a negative feedback system. And a good example of that would be the heating system in a home, Whereas the temperature rises, it's detected, and once it hits the appropriate level, say the thermostat is set at 20 degrees Celsius, once the temperature hits 20 degrees Celsius, it's detected and a signal is sent back to the furnace or the electrical system to shut down, because now it's at the appropriate level. So that's a negative feedback. The response has now hit the appropriate level, and so it gets this response is shut off. If the temperature drops, then below a certain, below 20, then the system turns back on to heat up the thing again. That's a typical negative feedback system. So here we see a diagram which goes through the negative feedback system in terms of glucose in the bloodstream. It is more complicated than just a rise in glucose level triggering insulin release, because there's also a response, and it's a different response when the blood glucose level drops too low. But always these kind of mechanisms, these regulatory mechanisms, homeostatic regulatory mechanisms, they always start out with some kind of stimulus, some sort of change. And the change here shown is a rise in blood glucose level after a meal. That's detected by cells in the pancreas that can release insulin. And they release insulin into the bloodstream, and cells in the body will take up more glucose. At the same time, the liver can take up more glucose and store it away in the form of a molecule called glycogen. But whatever, the fact that insulin is now released into the bloodstream because of that original glucose level rising, the effect is that the cells and the liver are taking up more glucose, and so the blood glucose level drops. And this is a negative feedback trigger for insulin release to slow down and stop, because the body's reached a balanced level. It's no longer detecting a higher glucose level in the bloodstream. Meanwhile, as it stops and the blood glucose level is dropping, the body still is using up glucose, and eventually the glucose level drops. So you get a too low a level, the level drops below a certain set point, and that low blood glucose level is detected, again, by cells in the pancreas, but different cells that can release a hormone called glucagon. So initially insulin, the hormone insulin, was released when glucose levels were higher, and now glucagon is released when glucagon gets released when glucose levels drop too low. That glucagon has an effect on the liver to trigger release of glucose from glycogen. Remember, glucose can be stored in the liver here as glycogen. If glucagon gets released because glucose levels were too low, then glycogen starts to release glucose. This is known as release of glucose from glycogen stores. So the response is that glucose gets released from the liver into the bloodstream, and so the glucose level rises and it's maintained at a certain adequate level. And once it rises, of course, glucagon stops getting released, etc., etc. So the system works. In this way, you have two negative feedback systems that maintain appropriate glucose levels in the bloodstream. Now there's another type of feedback, not a negative feedback, but it's called a positive feedback, where the response triggers a change, and that change triggers more of the same response. It intensifies, and then that causes a change, and that triggers even more response. An example of a positive feedback system where the response is continually building and building and building is in the regulation of blood clotting. When blood clots, what happens is if there's a tear in a blood vessel, a break or a tear, there are molecules which get exposed that trigger activation of platelets and also activation of clotting proteins or clotting factors. And that causes clotting or blood coagulation to start. And it's a cascade event where it keeps going and going until the break is completely sealed. So the whole thing carries on until, and it gets intensifies and intensifies until finally there is no more response. So it's a all or none kind of thing. Perhaps an easier example of a positive feedback mechanism, an easier example of more easily understood example is involves the hormone oxytocin. Women release oxytocin when they start to reach full term in pregnancy. So when they reach 9 months, at some point, oxytocin starts to get, small amounts of oxytocin start to get released from glands in the brain called the pituitary, the gland in the brain called the pituitary gland. A small amount of oxytocin gets released. Now, oxytocin can cause contraction of the muscle that forms the uterus. So the muscle contracts. Now, that contraction is detected, and contraction of the muscle of the uterus triggers more oxytocin to be released, which triggers more intense contractions of the uterus, which triggers more oxytocin to get released, etc., etc., and builds and builds and builds until finally the sudden, the baby is born and it all stops. So it's a positive feedback mechanism where the response to the initial stimulus triggers an even bigger response, which, and the response in this case is release of oxytocin, which triggers even more contraction and triggers more response, and it intensifies and builds and builds and builds. Finally, there is an end point. There has to be some end point. But along the way, it's always a positive feedback system that intensifies, makes the response stronger and stronger and stronger. Whereas in the previous example, where we were looking at, say, the response to glucose levels, insulin response to glucose levels, once the glucose level starts to drop down, then instead of more insulin getting released in the bloodstream, less is released. That's a negative type of feedback. Okay. Now, typically in a disease, there is a disturbance in balance or homeostasis. The body's normal equilibrium is upset in some way, is not a proper set point, and you get a disease process occurring. A little vague, I'll admit, but and it's a little more than a little generalized statement, but disease processes typically involve some sort of imbalance in homeostatic regulation of some kind of one or more physiological systems. Okay, if we look, and this is now a completely different topic, it's kind of an aside, I suppose. If you look at the variation between individuals, we all are not all identical, other than identical twins. Humans do vary slightly, and I'm not talking about between males and females, but between all males and between all females. There's very slight variation in normal, external, internal anatomy. Typically, more than 90% of all the anatomical structures match a classical normal appearance, but nerves and blood vessels can take a somewhat different route from one person to the next as they course through the body, the pattern that they form. Sometimes small muscles may be missing in an individual, but extreme anatomical variations are very, very seldom seen. There is small percentage of people who are mirror image internally. They have their organs on the opposite side. They're arranged in an opposite manner. And so the heart could be on the right instead of the left. And it's unusual. It's a very low percentage, but it does happen. And they're perfectly normal in terms of health and lifespan. Okay, when we refer to a person's body, we always refer to it in one standardized position. Otherwise, you can't talk. You know, if the person is not standing in front of you, you cannot talk about it. If you're just describing it in words, you should be able to describe it to somebody else in a written form so that they know what part of the body you're talking about. You know, if somebody has a wound somewhere on their leg, you can describe it in such a way that they know what you're talking about. But in order to do that, we always have to refer to the person's body as being in the anatomical position. It has to be in a the person is in a standard pose or posture, and that is standing erect, straight, feet slightly apart, palms facing outwards, palms facing forward, so you can see the person's palms. Uh-oh. I didn't mean to move forward in the slides, but it's all right. So the person in the anatomical position, the person is standing straight, feet slightly apart, palms facing forward and thumbs facing outwards. And in describing something on the body, then you can use certain terms, knowing that it's with reference to this anatomical position. So in terms of higher or lower, towards or away from the head, respectively, towards the head, higher up in the body, or away from the head, lower down in the body, we use the terms superior and inferior. So you can say that the groin is superior to the knees, or the nose is superior to the chin, right? You can refer to, or the foot is inferior to the knee. So you can, in terms of vertical reference, always again realizing that the person is, you're referring to the person standing in an anatomical position. Superior and inferior help locate whatever it is you're trying to describe in terms of the vertical axis, right? Anterior and posterior is towards the front or back of the body. Medial, lateral, and intermediate. Medial refers to the midline. Lateral is away from the midline, in other words, to the sides. And intermediate is somewhere in between the medial and lateral. So we have superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, medial, lateral, and intermediate. And then we have proximal and distal, which means closer to or further away. And here it says from the origin, from the body's core, the torso. The torso's the body minus the arms and legs and head. So proximal or distal, towards the central core of the body. For example, if you're talking about somebody's arm, and they have a wound, say near their elbow, but it's just above the elbow, then it's the wound would be positioned proximal to the elbow, means closer to the main part of the body. So that means above the elbow, right? Because just above the elbow is closer to the torso. Distal would be further down the arm. Superficial and deep refer to closer or further away from the surface of the body. So a superficial cut is right at the surface, just on the skin, whereas a deep cut goes further into the tissues. These terms are very useful in describing locations on the body, always in reference to a body that's in the anatomical position. Now, these slides here, the next, I think, 2 slides, give examples of exactly what I was talking about. And if you're not clear, then go through these, and you should, between what I said earlier and this, you should be able to understand superior versus inferior, anterior versus posterior, medial versus lateral versus intermediate, proximal and distal, superficial and deep. Okay, as I told you, there are an awful lot of terms, new words, you have to become familiar with and make as part of your vocabulary. And these are all adjectives which help describe parts of the body. All right. The 2 major ones are axial and appendicular. Axial refers to the head, neck, and trunk without the legs or arms, and appendicular is an adjective for the limbs, the arms and the legs. So axial or appendicular. These other terms, and there are a lot of them here, I've underlined in red the ones that I feel you should know. So if you're talking about, say, a cut or pain, let's say a pain, a person has an abdominal pain. So as soon as that's said, you know that it's in the abdomen, this region here, an abdominal pain. If it's a pain in the neck, I've been called that, I suppose. If it's a pain in the neck, where? It's cervical. A person has an infection. What kind of infection? An oral infection. You know it's in their mouth. So all these terms that I've underlined in red are useful terms, adjectives that I would recommend that you learn. And through time, through the course, you will, and I don't need you to learn them now necessarily and memorize each one, but learn it and you start using them. This is the rear view, perineal, gluteal, femoral. Many of these terms, these adjectives are used to describe substructures in the body. The lumbar spine, the brachial artery, the femoral vein, the vertebral column. All these things, a plantar wart, that means a wart on the bottom of the person's foot, sole of their foot. So all of these are useful. Cephalic, vertebral, brachial, dorsal, lumbar, sacral. These are different sections of the spinal column. Gluteal, perineal, femoral, plantar. Okay, when we talk about, these are all things that will help you with understanding and knowing the terminology that's used in discussing and describing anatomy or anatomical structure. When we talk about the body, we often talk about a view, a certain plane of view. A plane is a flat, completely flat surface, but you can have several different planes through the body. A sagittal plane will divide the body into left and right. You can have a sagittal plane passing through the body at different points. If it goes right down through the middle of the body, right through the middle of the nose, down through the navel, right through the middle, it's called a mid-sagittal plane. Sometimes it's called a medial, but usually mid-sagittal plane. A plane that a flat surface dividing the body into anterior and posterior parts is a frontal plane. Any cross section of the body is a horizontal or transverse plane, and if it's at an odd angle, not 90 degrees to, the standard 90 degrees, it's an oblique section or oblique plane. And this next slide shows that. So here you see this plane here. I'll highlight it. Here, this plane here divides the body into left and right, and it goes right down through the middle, right? So that flat surface is a mid-sagittal plane. It is, of course, a medial plane also, but if it was shifted over more towards this right shoulder, her right shoulder, it would not be mid-sagittal anymore, but it would be medial. Frontal plane, in just a second, frontal plane is shown here. Okay. And that separates it into anterior and posterior areas. And it could be anywhere. I mean, you could move it up and forward so that it just passes through her nose, and then the frontal plane would show the nose on one side and the rest of her body on the other. Okay, but it'd still be a frontal plane. A transverse plane can be anywhere on the body, anywhere that ends up dividing the body up into superior and inferior portions. Okay, that's transverse plane. An oblique would be any odd angle going across like that, say, cutting across. Typically, we talk about a transverse plane or mid-sagittal or medial or frontal planes. And here you see some application of that. This is a frontal plane. These are different imaging techniques that image parts of the body. And here you see a frontal plane through the front of the body, showing on it the left lung and the right lung and some of the internal organs. Here's a transverse plane. This one is a transverse plane right across the midsection of the body, cutting across the, that's the front at the bottom and the posterior, the back at the top. And you see certain cross sections of certain organs. And here you see a mid-sagittal plane viewing, showing the cross section right through the middle of the vertebral column. So there's a mid-sagittal section. Okay, now another important fact or another important concept to understand in anatomy of the body are that there are cavities within the body. You have a dorsal cavity and a ventral cavity. Dorsal is more towards the back, so it's more posterior, and ventral is more forward or anterior. The dorsal cavity essentially is surrounding and protecting the nervous system. There are two subdivisions, the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity is in the skull and holds the brain. The vertebral cavity is within or beside, surrounded by the vertebral column, the vertebrae, and it surrounds the spinal cord, which is the spinal cord, of course, is the nerve tissue that runs down the middle of down your back, right beside the vertebral column. The ventral cavity, which is more ventral or anterior, contains the major internal organs, which are also called the viscera. There are two subdivisions. There is the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic, by the way, can be further divided into abdominal and pelvic cavities. And we'll see these on the next slides. So here, what you see in yellow is the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity, which together make up the dorsal body cavity. And on the right side of the image in red, you see the thoracic cavity that contains the heart and lungs mostly, and the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can be further subdivided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And all of this makes up the ventral. All of this is the ventral body cavity. So you have a dorsal body cavity and a ventral body cavity. Dorsal body cavity divided into cranial and vertebral, and the ventral cavity divided into the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities. These two cavities, by the way, thoracic and abdominal pelvic, are divided from each other by the diaphragm. Diaphragm's a muscle involved in breathing, respiration. Here's a frontal view, and things do get a little more complicated. So here again you see there's the diaphragm separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. There is the diaphragm, there's the abdominal cavity, there's the pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is further subdivided into four major parts. There is a left and right pleural cavity. There are left and right pleural cavities. There's the left right there. So that's the left. And there's the right. Please remember, it's very important you don't forget, nobody cares about your right and left. It's the patient's or person's right and left. Person you're talking about, right or left, not your right or left. So here, that's the left. And here, that's the right. Okay? In here, there's the left side. So these are the right and left pleural cavities. Around the heart, you have the pericardial cavity. And above that, you have what's called the mediastinum. I should tell you that sometimes this cavity here, the abdominal pelvic, is called the peritoneal cavity. I'll write that out for you if I can. It's a difficult writing with this, but peritoneal cavity, there's another term that I may use and is useful. That's an I, peritoneal cavity. Okay, let's move on. As I said, the thoracic cavity can be further subdivided into two pleural cavities, right and left, the mediastinum and the pericardial cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity is further subdivided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And here you see why it's marked body planes. I'm not sure, it shouldn't be. That's a mistake there. Let's just cross that out. These are cavities, not planes. The ventral body cavity, the subdivisions of the ventral body cavity, the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, all of those and others, all of them are surrounded by a membrane. And the membranes have a very particular kind of, have I really gone for 58? Okay, So the ventral cavity, the ventral cavity, ventral body cavity, and the subdivisions of that are surrounded by membranes all along the surface. And the membranes have a particular kind of structure. The membrane that covers the wall of the cavity is called the parietal membrane or parietal serosa. These membranes are called serosal membranes or serosa. The part that covers the wall is called the parietal serosa. The part that covers the membrane comes around and then continues over the internal organs. And that part is called the visceral serosa. And in between the two, you have serous fluid that reduces any friction, so the membranes don't rub against each other, they slide away from each other. So you have, for example, in the pleural cavities, let's say the left pleural cavity that contains the left lung, you have a parietal serosa on the wall, and that folds over the lung, and as it folds over, it forms and goes over the lung, it forms the visceral serosa, of the left pleural cavity. To give you an idea of how that works, it's like taking a balloon, and if you push your fist in, you can see that this membrane, the wall of the balloon here, now covers not only the outer wall, but also, let me get this, not only the outer wall, but also the internal structure, in this case the hand that forms that fist, but it's the equivalent of the internal organs. So this is like the wall of the cavity on the wall here, and that would be the equivalent of the parietal serosa, and then it also folds down and follows the internal organ structure. This would be the visceral serosa. And here you see that for the pericardial cavity, there is a parietal serosa and a visceral serosa. Because it's the pericardial cavity, it's called the parietal pericardium. The membrane is called along the wall is called the parietal pericardium, and the one on the surface of the organ itself is called the visceral pericardium. So if we were looking at the pleural cavity, the left pleural cavity, you would have a left parietal pleural membrane and a left visceral pleural membrane. Okay, so you have these membrane structures, and in between the two you have serosal fluid so that they slide nicely. These organs are moving, your lungs are moving, your heart is beating, it's moving. It's protected by the membrane. It's not rubbing in any way. It's, well, there is some slight friction, but for the most part, between the two layers of membrane, it's sliding nicely because of the serosal fluid. There are other body cavities, and they include the oral, digestive, nasal, orbital, middle ear, and synovial. Synovial cavities are in joints. Now, to make things simple when describing the abdominal pelvic region of the body, you can describe it in terms of quadrants. The right upper, which is here. Remember, it's not your right, it's the patient's right side. The left upper, it's the patient's left, not your left. Nobody cares about yours, left or right. It's their left or right that counts. So you have a right upper quadrant, a left upper quadrant, a right lower quadrant, and a left lower quadrant. And that describes the abdominal pelvic area crudely into 4 distinct regions. There are more defined types of descriptions, which you'll see on the next slide, but I wouldn't hold you responsible for those. But here, yes, you need to know the right upper, left lower, left lower. You know, if a patient is being described in medical notes in the chart as having a pain and it's in the right lower quadrant, that tells you quite a bit. Is it a deep pain? Is it a superficial pain? Let's say they have a intermediate, which would be halfway between the medial line here. Let me make that darker. Intermediate would be halfway between the medial and the lateral side. So they have an intermediate pain in the right lower quadrant. Well, that places it approximately here, more or less where the appendix is. As I said, there are more detailed descriptive terms for different abdominal pelvic areas, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for these. Okay, this is the last slide of Unit 1, Part 2. I wouldn't hold you responsible, as I said, to know the 9 different regions here, the terms for the 9 different regions or the underlying organs, but you should understand that what we've talked about for a lot of this part of Unit 1 is how to describe different areas of the body so that a person listening or reading knows exactly what you're referring to. And so with that, that's the end of that.